Good morning to you. Thank you so much for keeping it here on morning at NTV. Stephen Imbido on Buga. I'm coming to you from the NIM Secretariat here in Nakasero. Behind me are flags for Uganda. There's one for East Africa, but also the one for African Union. And our forefathers, I'm talking about former African leaders like Nelson Mandela, the late Nelson Mandela, the late Julius Nyerere, and the former Archbishop of South Africa, Desmond Tutu, were champions of African unity, Ubuntu, and Pan-Africanism. But what we see happening now in South Africa, and if these people were to come back today, they would either weep or they would feel very unfortunate with the events of attacks, threats on fellow Africans. I'm talking about the waves of xenophobia happening in South Africa. Many countries are now beginning to to repatriate their own nationals. I'm talking about Nigeria. Today, there is a plane that will be landing in Lagos, carrying hundreds of Nigerians, but also Ghana, Malawi, Zimbabwe, all have repatriated their nationals. And I'm told even Burundi is keeping a group of Burundians in South Africa. And when you go to South Africa, provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, the situation is not normal. But I want to understand, how is Africa or South Africa getting to this kind of unsafety for fellow Africans? Director of External Relations at NRM Secretariat is none other than retired Major Paula Awich. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Bido.
You've been to South Africa, you're a Pan-Africanist yourself, but when you see the events happening in South Africa, I know it's not the first time they are giving an ultimatum of 30th June, when they're going to have, they want to have all illegal migrants out of their own homeland. And they're saying, if not, they're going to carry out nationwide protests. How is South Africa getting back to this?
Thank you so much, and greetings to the viewers. The NRM has very strong historical relationship with South Africa and ANC in particular. So the situation in South Africa upsets us. I've been in South Africa a couple of times, and just recently I was there. But also recently in the swearing of President Museveni, ANC was represented at a very high level with a minister. And we had a dinner with them, took photos with President Museveni. We were happy with them. However, we are surprised with the events in South Africa, like you are surprised. Because all nations have philosophies which guides their country. For example, if you have a country which is so much into petroleum mining, they have philosophies around that and they export it. You have countries like environment, like Norway. That is the philosophy that guides them, and they help environmental protection all over the world. Now, South African philosophy is a philosophy of freedom and Pan-Africanism. And that is why you can see them taking Israel to court, because they are saying we came from this history, and therefore Israel cannot do it to Palestinians. That's why they went to ICC. That's why you see them strongly supporting Polisario, the Sahrawi Republic in Morocco. And that's why you see them so close to Cuba, even at hard times. So we are surprised that in the practicing of this philosophy, depending on their history, because they're saying never again. Because they're saying we went through apartheid, through the bad way, we shall not see it again. But it's being seen now. Of course, nobody wants illegality in a country. But we would expect that South Africa does a well thought out law and executes law properly. They are very alive to the fact, for example, in Uganda alone, when the South African fighting was so intense and a South African regime had nearly swept them from the frontline states. Remember the African countries which had declared themselves frontline. Frontline meaning what? That we are ready, we are at war with the South African white regime then. This is Angola, Mozambique, Zambia. They bombed the Zambian Conference Center like this one we have in Serena, where NTV is. South African white regime bombed it because ANC had their headquarters there. They were bombing Mozambique, and Nyerere was here nearly collecting everybody in the front line. Now, Museveni came in 86 and really brought all the freedom fighters here in Uganda, took them to Kawaweta, trained them, took them back in thousands. With those days, they were even armed with scorpion pistol, the freedom fighters who went there. Scorpion pistol were a pistol even ladies would put in a belega. And you go to where the soldiers are, pull it in a belega and shoot. The guys fought their war. Now, even in Uganda, they threatened to bomb our state house. And even in the cabinet where Museveni was chairing, cabinets were divided, chased South African fighters because the white regime was going to bomb us. The likes of the rear category said, no, we can't chase our brothers. Besides, we'd be running away from the face of the enemy. Cabinet was divided, chasing South African or not. Museveni said no. To date, their graves are in Kaweta, in Nakaseke. Many of them who succumbed to malaria and whatever. Now, to find South African at this stage chasing fellow Africans is not a pleasing thing. Because during fight, states had volunteered that we are front-line states to liberate our brothers.
You know, Major, you are the Director of External Relations, and this, of course, falls directly into your docket. We know, of course, now supermarkets are being looted. Fellow Africans, I haven't heard of any Ugandans who are caught up in this situation, but I know they are living in the state of uncertainty. They don't know what happens tomorrow or even on 30th. Is this that's something coming on the table with of NRM government, like the liaise with the South African counterparts to see the safety of Ugandans also should be paramount?
The safety of Ugandans definitely is paramount because even when as a party we form our manifesto and go and market to the people to vote for us, the core principle in that manifesto is that we shall protect Ugandans, their lives and their property, and wherever they are. We can do it outside jurisdiction using the jurisdiction of that country because the security of Ugandans in another country rests with that host countries. But we can offer consular services. So when Ugandans are in distress, like in KwaZulu-Natal, Joburg or anywhere, our embassies are always on standby to offer consular services. But also at bilateral level, I believe either President Museveni is already discussing it with his brother, the South African president, or it will come up because it's not a topical thing. I am sure he will raise it up either at bilateral issues or even at the right forum. But for now, the safety of Ugandans, like we promise in our manifesto to protect them, is we shall do it. And Foreign Affairs is alive to that fact. Either through consular services, whenever they're in distress in KwaZulu-Natal, and therefore Ugandans who are there should keep in constant touch with the embassy. You know, in a bilateral relationship between two governments.
One who is watching Morning at NTV now would say, okay, look, this situation where Ugandans are fighting themselves could also be blamed on the NRM government because many of them are illegally staying in South Africa because they went seeking for jobs that they cannot find in Uganda if NRM government having been in power for the last 40 years, was giving these opportunities. Many of these young Ugandans wouldn't be in South Africa, now facing the situation they are in now.
That is not correct. Because first of all, you can't provide jobs for everybody. Secondly, the issue of migrant workers is a global matter. Why? Because there is job imbalance or population imbalance around the world. I went to Berlin and I boarded the bus. When I boarded the bus, I reached home. I told my host that I'd boarded the wrong bus. He asked me why. I said in the bus, the youngest was 65 years. He said, no, there's a population here. So you find in some part of the world, people are too old. They don't have. But in other parts like Middle East, people don't have that kind of labor force. United Nations came up in 1990 with a convention called Convention on Migrant Workers. Why? Because there is imbalance of labor. They have already seen it. That was way before the Ugandan situation. Filipino export 11 million nurses around the world. Mexico export 12 million South Africa. And to the extent that Mexican acted a film that one day without Mexican. Because Americans were disturbing them. They said, okay, let us see one day who will pick your tomatoes, who will pick your eggs, who will do your what. America will be stagnant. So the question of migrant workers is not an NRM failure. The question of migrant workers is that all over the world there's imbalance in labor. So somehow people will move. That is why United Nations came up with a convention. If it was a Ugandan thing, nobody would come with a convention. And Uganda exports the least number of migrant workers compared to Kenya or any other country. We are the least compared to Nigeria. So the understanding that because people move out is a failure of NRM is not correct. It's a global matter. That is why the world came up with a convention on migrant workers to protect workers in their host country where they are, and also their remaining families. The law is very clear. It is a UN law.
Uganda and South Africa, yes, they continue to enjoy diplomatic and trade economic relations. I know so many South African companies are operating here. Talk about the telecom companies, the banking sector, and the like. They are investing here heavily. But also, we know that Uganda, looking at the prospects of the production from oil, South Africa is also looking at having ventures here in Uganda. When this happens, I'm talking about the situation of xenophobia in South Africa, doesn't it really hurt business, the bilateral relationship between countries like Uganda and South Africa?
It does hurt, whether in business or otherwise. Because look, even a mere moral support in Mexico, it was portrayed like African countries are supporting a country playing against South Africa. Ideally, you'd expect African countries supporting South Africa. So even in business areas, it will affect, because we don't do business in a vacuum. We do business for the well-being of our people. And you're not going to go doing business when the other party is being beaten and chased and what it affects. And that's why Nigeria is so cross with South Africa. So it is true that even when we have a business situations, it will hurt. Because to reach where we are, that business you are talking about, it was a struggle. Remember that Uganda, in fighting for South Africa, we had sanctioned them to the extent that Ugandan passport used to read to all countries except South Africa. We even sanctioned them that our Ugandan passport was embedded. You are free to, a Ugandan is free to fly all over the world except South Africa. Why? Because we want to sanction them. So therefore, in that situation, you wouldn't have their banks here, you wouldn't have their airlines here, you wouldn't have their supermarket here, you wouldn't have all their things. At the time, we're sanctioning them because we had bad relationship. And we wouldn't like to go back there. And I'm sure they wouldn't like to go back there because right now, they basically take the continental market.
Yeah. And finally, as we go back to the studios, I know Uganda has also removed visa restrictions to South Africa as we continue to bolster trade relations. I want to understand from you as we wind up. For the business community and the Ugandans, I know more than 20,000 are operating illegally, Ugandans in South Africa. But there are also over 50 who are operating there under legal terms. What would you tell Ugandans right there in South Africa, those who are operating legally, but also those who are operating legally and undercover? What would you tell them in this current situation?
First of all, I tell them that they should operate within the law, and those who are illegal should get a way of legalizing themselves, because we can't promote illegality. But the best of it also should be that the South African laws should take care of the philosophy of their history. Because laws we make not in vacuum. Our laws are dictated by our past. And that is why I'm surprised that they practice their law at international level according to their history. And they don't seem to put that law at domestic level, caring about their history. But they should have a well-thought law, and once that law is there, we should really tell our Ugandans to observe that law. Because I want to close by saying the history of South Africa is so embedded in the struggle with Museveni, to the extent that when we were in Kadogo school, we had South African Kadogo. Can you imagine? Because when Museveni decided that NRA side soldiers should go back, there were also child soldiers in South African fighters who were here. Museveni took all of us. I was with them in Intare school.
Retired Major Paula Okwil, thank you so much for your time and sharing these insights. I know the spirit of Ubuntu still lives in Africa, and these issues will be solved within, I think, the required time. These issues should be resolved amicably between countries, but also brothers and sisters in South Africa there. Stephen Imbido on Fefeswe Chibuga taking you back to studios of Morning at NTV.